Have you ever caught yourself wondering who you'd be if that one thing hadn't happened? Maybe it's not just one thing. Maybe it's 100 small things that clawed their way into your memory over the years: your parents' divorce, that time you were bullied in school, the breakup that shattered your trust, the quiet loneliness you never talked about, the night you couldn't sleep because your thoughts were too loud. What if none of it had happened? Would you be a different person? Would you still be you? It's a question that doesn't let go easily. It creeps in during the quiet moments, like when you're staring out the window with music playing in the background, or when you're lying in bed at 2 a.m., wondering why you feel the way you do about the people in your life. It's one of those deeply human questions that blends psychology with philosophy, emotion with thought. And it's not just a hypothetical. It's something we carry around, whether we realize it or not. We live in a time where trauma is no longer a taboo subject. People talk about it openly now, in therapy sessions, on social media, in podcasts, in books. There's a shared vocabulary around pain that never really existed before, not in this way. We say childhood trauma, attachment wounds, emotional neglect, and we nod knowingly, as if just naming these things helps make sense of them. And in a way, it does. But behind all the language, behind the healing practices and coping mechanisms, there's a quieter, more unsettling question. Who would I be if I had never gone through any of this? Would I be happier? Would I be softer? Stronger? Colder? More ambitious? More trusting? Or would I simply be someone else? That's where it gets tricky. Because if trauma shapes us, and nearly every psychologist and philosopher agrees that it does, then removing it from the equation would mean rewriting the very code that makes us who we are. But does that mean our suffering is essential? Are we just a sum of the things that hurt us? Or are we something deeper, something untouched beneath it all? These aren't easy questions, and they don't come with clean answers. But that's what makes them worth exploring. In this essay, we're going to dive headfirst into the tangled roots of identity, memory, pain, and selfhood. We'll look at how trauma affects the brain, what ancient philosophers thought about suffering and transformation, and why we often feel a strange sense of loyalty to the very things that broke us. This isn't going to be a dry academic dissection or a clinical analysis with bullet points and citations. No, this is a conversation, honest, messy, vulnerable. The kind you might have with a close friend at 1 a.m., when the masks are off and the truth starts to pour out. Because let's face it, we all carry scars. Some of them are visible, most of them are not. But they shape the way we move through the world. The way we love, the way we fear, the way we protect ourselves from more hurt. And sometimes, when we think about healing, we're not just thinking about becoming whole. We're thinking about whether it's possible to become someone else entirely, someone unscarred. But what if the scars aren't just damage? What if they're also design? So let's start there, with the question that haunts us. Would you still be you without your trauma? To understand how trauma might shape or even define who we are, we have to get inside the machinery of the human mind. Not just in a metaphorical sense, but in a biological one too. Because trauma doesn't just leave behind emotional residue, it rewires us. Quite literally. Think of the brain not as some fixed, static thing, but as an ever-evolving structure, one that adapts to survive, to cope, to protect. When we go through something traumatic, whether it's a sudden, violent event or years of subtle emotional neglect, our brain doesn't just take note and move on. It builds around it. It reorganizes. It reshapes how we feel, how we think, how we respond. One of the key players in this whole process is the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting danger and triggering the body's fight-or-flight response. In people who've experienced trauma, the amygdala becomes hypervigilant, almost like it's constantly scanning the environment for potential threats, even when none exist. This means your body might respond to a raised voice or a disapproving look as if it's being attacked. You might feel your heart race, your chest tighten, your thoughts scatter, even when there's no real danger present. Then there's the hippocampus, the part that helps us form and access memories. Trauma can shrink it. Literally. That's why memories of traumatic experiences often feel distorted, fragmented, or strangely vivid. It's also why people sometimes remember every tiny detail of something painful, while forgetting huge chunks of what happened around it. Trauma doesn't just affect what we remember, it affects how we remember. And let's not forget the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thinking, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Trauma can suppress its function, especially when we're triggered. That's why someone who seems calm and logical most of the time might suddenly become overwhelmed, irrational, or shut down completely when a deep emotional wound gets touched. The brain isn't broken in those moments, it's doing what it learned to do to keep you safe. But all of this leads to something deeper. Trauma doesn't just change how we react to stress. It changes how we view ourselves, others, and the world. It can make us distrustful, guarded, overly sensitive, or numb. It can cause us to withdraw or lash out. It can make love feel dangerous and vulnerability feel like a trap. It can teach us that we are unworthy, or broken, or too much. And over time, these learned beliefs stop feeling like beliefs. They start to feel like identity. That's where it gets complicated. Because when a belief gets folded into our identity, I'm not lovable, I ruin everything, I'm always the outsider, we stop questioning it. It becomes part of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. And if we start peeling those layers away, we might feel like we're losing something essential. We might even grieve it, strangely enough. As painful as those beliefs are, they're familiar. They give us a sense of continuity. They help explain why we are the way we are. Letting go of them can feel like standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea what's on the other side. But here's something we don't talk about enough. Trauma can also give us things. And that's not to romanticize suffering, because there's nothing beautiful about pain in itself. But the adaptations we develop in response to trauma, hyperawareness, empathy, sensitivity, resilience, creativity, those can become strengths. They can shape how we relate to people, how we understand the world, how we express ourselves. The very traits that make us feel too much or too intense are often the result of our brains trying to survive. And sometimes, they end up being the things that make us powerful. This is where psychology starts bleeding into philosophy. Because now we're asking, if trauma changes us at such a deep level, if it shapes our thoughts, our emotions, even our personalities, can we still claim to be the same person we would have been without it? And more than that, do we want to be that other person? Do we even know who that person is? It's tempting to imagine a version of ourselves untouched by trauma, someone happier, more confident, more open. But that version is a ghost. They don't exist. They never did. All we have is the person we became in response to what happened. And maybe that's enough. Or maybe it's just the beginning. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper, not into the science, but into the soul. We'll ask what the philosophers have to say about suffering, identity, and transformation. Because long before neuroscience ever put trauma under a microscope, the great thinkers were already wrestling with it. And their answers might surprise you. Long before MRI scans lit up images of the traumatized brain, long before clinical terms like PTSD or emotional dysregulation were coined, human beings were already asking the same haunting question: what do we become through suffering? Philosophy, in many ways, is a conversation with pain, sometimes trying to soothe it, sometimes trying to understand it, and sometimes just trying to survive it. The ancient thinkers didn't have the language of neuroscience, but they had something just as powerful: the courage to ask what it means to live with a broken heart, a broken world, or a broken self. Let's start with the Stoics. People often misinterpret Stoicism as cold or emotionless, like it's about repressing feelings. But that's not it at all. The Stoics, especially thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, believed that suffering is inevitable, and more importantly, it's not the suffering itself that defines us, but how we respond to it. Epictetus, for example, was born into slavery. He endured physical abuse and constant dehumanization, but he still insisted that no one could harm his soul without his permission. That inner core, he argued, was untouchable. You could beat his body, chain him, humiliate him, but his essence remained his own. To the Stoics, trauma doesn't define the self, it reveals it. Then there's Nietzsche. If you've ever heard the quote, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," you've heard a fragment of his thinking. But Nietzsche wasn't promoting toxic positivity or romanticizing pain. He was obsessed with the idea of transformation through suffering, what he called becoming who you are. He believed that real growth often comes not through comfort or ease, but through struggle, that our deepest truths emerge from the darkest places. He even said that people who suffer deeply tend to see the world more clearly, more honestly. They're not distracted by illusions or polite lies. Pain sharpens perception. And yes, it scars, but it also carves out depth. In Eastern philosophy, suffering isn't just a personal problem, it's the foundation of human existence. Buddhism, for example, begins with the first noble truth: life is suffering. That sounds bleak, but it's actually liberating when you dig deeper. Buddhism doesn't say you're broken because you're suffering. It says you're human because you're suffering. And rather than trying to avoid pain, the practice is about understanding it, sitting with it, letting it transform you. The ego, the illusion of a fixed, unchanging self, is often the source of suffering. And trauma, as terrible as it is, has a strange way of cracking the ego wide open. Even existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir wrestled with trauma, not necessarily from a clinical perspective, but from a human one. For them, suffering was tied to freedom. That sounds contradictory, but their point was this: once you realize that life doesn't come with a built-in meaning, you're free to create your own. And often, that moment of realization comes during or after some kind of trauma. A war, a loss, a betrayal, a collapse. These events force you to confront the absurdity of life and then decide, actively, how you want to live anyway. That's where freedom begins. Not in forgetting the pain, but in choosing what it means. All of these philosophies, from the Stoics to the Buddhists to the existentialists, seem to agree on one central thing. Pain is not just something to be avoided. It's something to be understood, engaged with, respected, even, because it touches the most intimate part of us, the part that asks who we are and why we're here. But that's the strange tension, isn't it? We don't want to need our pain. We want to believe we would be just as wise, just as deep, just as kind without having suffered. But the truth is, we don't know. And maybe we'll never know. The philosophers don't give us clean answers. They never do. What they give us is a mirror. They show us that wrestling with pain isn't a detour from identity. It's part of the path. Sometimes, it is the path. So what does all of this mean when we go back to that original question? Would you still be you without your trauma? Maybe the philosophers would say, there is no you without experience. And experience, by nature, includes suffering. Trying to subtract your pain from your identity is like trying to remove fire from light. You can't. The question isn't whether your trauma made you who you are. The question is what you're going to do with that truth. Most people think of trauma as something that happened in the past, a chapter that ended, a wound that either healed or didn't. But for many of us, trauma isn't locked away in a dusty mental attic. It's present. It's active. It lives in our choices, in our habits, in the pauses between conversations. It shows up when we don't expect it, often in moments so ordinary we wouldn't even think to connect them with pain. But that's what trauma does. It hides in plain sight. You can feel it in the way someone flinches at kindness, in the way they smile and say, "I'm fine," a little too quickly, in the way they change the subject when things get too real. Trauma often masquerades as personality. The anxious one, the avoidant one, the overachiever, the loner, the people pleaser. We slap these labels on ourselves like they're just quirks, but often they're responses, adaptations we made so we could survive. And when those adaptations get praised by society, when our anxiety gets rebranded as being really responsible, or our emotional numbness gets seen as being chill and low maintenance, it's even harder to see them for what they are. Signs of old wounds still bleeding under the surface. Maybe you felt it when someone gets too close, emotionally, physically, and something in you recoils, even if you like them. It doesn't feel safe, and you don't know why. Or maybe you're always the one who gives, who listens, who supports, but deep down, it's not just about love. It's about control, about avoiding rejection, about being needed so you can feel like you matter. Or maybe it's more subtle. Maybe you feel like you're constantly waiting for something to go wrong. Like happiness is a setup, like calm is a trick. That's trauma, too, not the event, but the expectation. The brain conditioned to anticipate danger, even in safety. It shows up in relationships the most, doesn't it? Romantic, familial, even friendships. Trauma loves relationships because that's where it was often born. Attachment wounds formed in early childhood don't just vanish with age. They mutate. They become invisible contracts we carry into adulthood. Rules like don't get too close, or they'll leave, or you have to earn love, or you're too much, so tone it down. We start living from those rules without even realizing it. And then, when relationships feel hard or scary or painful, we blame ourselves. But really, we're just reenacting old scripts with new actors. And it's not just the big, dramatic reactions that signal trauma. Sometimes it's the emptiness, the numbness, the way your mind checks out when things get overwhelming, or the way you self-sabotage the moment things start going well. People talk about fear of failure, but there's also fear of peace. For some of us, peace feels unfamiliar, foreign, even unsafe. And so we create chaos without realizing we're doing it. We pick fights. We procrastinate. We ghost people. Not because we want to ruin things, but because our nervous system is still trying to protect us from a danger that no longer exists. Work is another place it hides, not just in burnout or perfectionism, but in the constant need to prove something, to be productive, valuable, worthy. How many people are silently running from the fear of being not enough? How many chase success not because they love what they're doing, but because they're terrified of what it would mean if they stopped? The trauma response doesn't always look like breakdown. Sometimes it looks like ambition, like discipline, like someone who has it all together until you see the panic behind their eyes. And then there's the inner voice, that narrator in your head. If you've experienced trauma, especially emotional trauma, that voice is often crueler than you realize. It tells you you're too sensitive, that you're overreacting, that your needs are annoying, that your feelings are inconvenient. That's not your real voice. That's the internalized echo of how someone once treated you. And it's heartbreaking how many people think that's just how they are. It's not. It's how they were taught to speak to themselves in order to feel safe, or small, or invisible enough to survive. But here's the most important part. Recognizing these patterns isn't about blaming yourself or digging endlessly into the past. It's about noticing how your present is being shaped by things you never got a chance to process. It's about realizing that you are not broken, you're patterned. And patterns can change. Slowly, gently, not by force, but by awareness. And once you start to see how trauma shows up in your daily life, you can begin to meet it with compassion instead of shame. So the question becomes, if so much of who we are, how we love, how we think, how we act, is shaped by pain, are we even capable of becoming someone different? Or is healing just another word for changing shape again, this time with intention? When people talk about healing, they often imagine it as a kind of return, a homecoming, a way of getting back to who they were before the trauma happened, before things got hard, before the heartbreak, the betrayal, the violence, the silence, the loss. But here's the uncomfortable truth that no one really prepares us for. There is no before to go back to. Trauma doesn't just knock us off course, it changes the map. And healing? Healing isn't retracing your steps. It's building a whole new path, sometimes from scratch. That can feel overwhelming, even unfair, because we want things to feel familiar again. We want to return to ease, to innocence, to that version of ourselves that wasn't yet carrying all this. But often, that version of us didn't even know how vulnerable they were, or how unsafe things really were, or how much was being buried just to function. Wanting to go back can sometimes be a wish to unknow something we now can't unsee. And that's where healing becomes not a rewind, but a transformation, a becoming. You don't just heal by forgetting what happened. You heal by remembering in new ways, by letting yourself feel what you couldn't feel then, say what you couldn't say, protect what wasn't protected. That's why healing hurts. It's not linear. It's not glamorous. It's not always visible. It often looks like falling apart, because, in many ways, it is. Old defenses crumble. Coping mechanisms get stripped away. And underneath all of that, you're left with raw truth. But here's the magic. You get to choose what happens next. Healing asks us to become the parent we didn't have, the friend we needed, the voice we were denied. It asks us to rebuild ourselves from the inside out, not to erase the scars, but to honor them. To say, yes, this happened, and I didn't deserve it, and I survived, and now I get to decide who I become. That kind of healing is radical. It's not soft or passive. It's fierce. It means facing parts of yourself you've spent years trying to avoid. The anger, the shame, the grief, especially the grief. Not just for what happened, but for what didn't happen. The love you didn't get, the safety you never felt, the version of you that never got to exist. You mourn all of it. And mourning, as it turns out, is a form of healing. It's the body's way of saying, I finally believe I deserved better. Some people will try to rush you through this. They'll want the happy ending, the tidy narrative. They'll say things like, that was a long time ago, or you've got to move on. But healing doesn't obey social timelines. It's not something you check off a list. And it's not something you do for other people's comfort. It's for you. And it happens in cycles. You might feel totally fine for months, and then suddenly, something will trigger an old wound, and it'll all come rushing back. That doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human. It means healing is still happening. What's beautiful, though, is how healing makes space for things you didn't think were possible anymore. Safety, joy, intimacy, presence. It's slow, and it's fragile, but it's real. You start to recognize when you're acting from fear instead of truth. You pause instead of react. You choose curiosity over shame. You speak up instead of shrinking. And maybe, for the first time, you feel like you're living from the inside out, instead of the outside in. And still, The question lingers. If this healing version of me is different from the person I was before the trauma, then who am I really? Is the healed self the true self? Or is it just another version I'm growing into? This is where it helps to let go of the idea that there's one fixed, true self waiting to be found. Maybe we're more like rivers, always changing, always responding to the terrain, always moving. Maybe there's no authentic self behind the trauma. Maybe there's just who we choose to become now, with everything we've learned, everything we've carried, and everything we've finally laid down. Healing doesn't make the trauma go away. It doesn't erase what happened, but it does change the role it plays in your life. It stops being the author of your story and becomes just one chapter. A heavy one, sure. A painful one, but not the only one, and certainly not the last. This is the part where things start to get messy. Not in a bad way, just in that deeply human, existential way that leaves you staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering who the hell you actually are. Because if trauma changes you, and healing changes you again, and every experience reshapes how you think and feel and respond, then what part of you stays the same through all of that? Is there a you underneath it all? Or are you just a collection of stories, reactions, memories, and hopes taped together with a name? Let's not rush past that question, because it touches something core. Most of us like to believe there's a solid self somewhere in there, a kind of emotional anchor. This is who I am. We cling to that identity, especially when things feel uncertain. But if you really start looking, what you'll find isn't a solid rock. It's more like a shifting current. Some days, you feel brave. Some days, you feel scared. Some days, you're kind. Other days, you snap at someone you love for no real reason. So which version is the real you? Here's a different idea. Maybe they all are. Maybe identity isn't about finding one true self and clinging to it forever. Maybe it's about learning how to hold all your parts, the ones you're proud of and the ones you still struggle to accept. Maybe you're not a statue being chiseled into shape, but more like a canvas, something always in progress, always being painted and repainted as life moves through you. Think about it. The version of you that existed before your trauma, that version wasn't necessarily more real, just less aware, less shaped, less complicated, and maybe also less compassionate, less nuanced, less awake. Pain tends to crack us open in a way that nothing else really can. That's not a justification, it's just a reality. If you've ever met someone who's done real inner work after deep suffering, you know there's a gravity to them, a softness, a clarity. They don't need to prove who they are, they know. And yet, even that version is not final, because identity is layered, contextual, fluid. Who you are in a crisis is not who you are in a moment of joy. Who you are with your best friend is not who you are in a job interview. This doesn't mean you're fake, it means you're multifaceted. Human beings are complex systems, not one-note characters. The danger is when we get stuck thinking we are our trauma, or our pain, or our defense mechanisms. We say things like, I'm just an anxious person, or I'm not good with vulnerability, and we start to live from that label. But those aren't truths. Those are survival stories, and stories can be rewritten. This is where self-awareness becomes powerful, because the moment you recognize that you're not your patterns, you're the one observing them, you open up a whole new kind of freedom. You're no longer trapped inside your trauma response. You can see it for what it is, a brilliant, often beautiful way your mind and body tried to protect you. And from that place, you can start choosing new responses. You can experiment. You can ask, what happens if I try this instead? Not because you're pretending to be someone else, but because you're expanding into more of yourself. That's the paradox. Trauma narrows you. Healing expands you. And identity is not about choosing between one or the other. It's about integrating all of it. The scared version of you, the angry version, the joyful version, the curious one, the exhausted one, the one that still doesn't know how to trust, and the one that's learning. You don't lose yourself through trauma, but you might lose touch with certain parts of you. The playful part, the trusting part, the part that believed in good things. Those parts don't die, they just go underground. And healing is often the long, tender process of coaxing them back into the light. So who are you really? You're the whole damn spectrum. You're the ache and the laughter, the fear and the reaching out, the voice that says, I can't do this, and the one that keeps going anyway. You're not just your story, you're also the storyteller. And that means you have the power to decide what kind of character you want to be, what kind of life you want to live. what kind of meaning you want to make from all of it. That's not easy. It's not quick, but it's possible. And the more you explore identity as something alive and shifting, the less pressure you feel to be a certain way. You don't have to be healed to be worthy. You don't have to be over it to be loved. You just have to be willing to show up as you are today. That's where real identity starts. Not with a label, but with presence. If there's one place trauma shows its fingerprints most clearly, it's in how we love and how we let ourselves be loved. You can spend years working on yourself, reading all the right books, going to therapy, learning how to sit with your emotions. But the moment you start to let someone close, the old wounds resurface. It's not weakness. It's not regression. It's just that relationships have a way of activating the very parts of us that are still tender. That's their power and their danger. Love, in its healthiest form, requires openness, vulnerability, surrender. But for someone whose trust was once broken, or who learned early on that love is conditional, unpredictable, or unsafe, those very things can feel threatening. What others experience as intimacy, you might experience as risk. Being seen, truly seen, can feel like standing in front of a firing squad, even if the person looking at you only has love in their eyes. So we armor up, sometimes consciously, sometimes not. We keep conversations surface level. We joke instead of express. We give a lot, but never ask for much. Or we test people. We push them away just to see if they'll come back. We become masters of reading tone, watching for shifts in mood, bracing for the day when the other shoe will inevitably drop. Because when trauma has taught you that connection equals danger, you learn to stay ready. But staying ready means staying distant. Even if you're physically close, even if you're in a relationship, you can be lying next to someone and still feel completely alone if part of you is convinced they can't possibly love the real you. And that's the tragedy of trauma in relationships. It convinces you that your deepest need, connection, is also your greatest threat. It gets more complex when both people bring their own wounds into the relationship, which, let's be honest, is almost always the case. We're not out here as blank slates. We all carry baggage. We all have histories. Sometimes, our trauma responses complement each other in painful ways. One partner needs space when triggered, the other needs closeness. One shuts down, the other escalates. One avoids conflict like the plague, the other needs resolution right now. And unless both people understand their patterns, those dynamics can spiral quickly, leaving both partners feeling unseen, unloved, and unsafe. What makes this even harder is the guilt. You want to be open. You want to trust. You want to let someone hold you. But when your nervous system is still wired for danger, your heart says yes while your body says no. That internal split can be devastating. You start thinking there's something wrong with you. That maybe you're just not built for love. That maybe you're too broken, too damaged, too much. But that's the trauma talking. That's the old script replaying. The truth is, love after trauma is possible. Trust after betrayal is possible. But it takes work. Not just the work of loving someone else, but the even harder work of letting yourself be loved. Really loved. Seen in your contradictions. Held in your mess. Not fixed. Not saved. Just met, exactly as you are. That means choosing relationships that feel safe, not just exciting. That means slowing down when your instinct is to speed up or shut down. That means being honest, not just with your partner, but with yourself. It means saying things like, I know this reaction is bigger than the moment, but it's real for me. Or, this isn't about you, but something about this is activating an old fear. That kind of transparency builds trust. Not the illusion of perfection, but the real, gritty kind of trust that comes from being human together. And it also means taking responsibility. Because trauma isn't your fault, but what you do with it is your responsibility. You don't get to use your past as a permanent excuse to hurt people. Healing doesn't mean you'll never mess up, but it means you're willing to own it when you do. To learn, to repair, to try again. Sometimes, relationships become the very space where healing happens. The right person won't be scared off by your scars. They'll hold space for them. But even then, you have to let them. You have to take the risk of opening up, even when your mind is screaming, don't. And sometimes, it won't work. Sometimes, love alone isn't enough to untangle two people's pain. That's okay. That's not failure. That's information. Every relationship, even the painful ones, teaches us something about where we're still healing, where we're still afraid, where we still need to grow. Here's what's most important. You're allowed to take your time, to heal at your own pace, to need reassurance, to draw boundaries, to fall apart sometimes and be held. Love doesn't require you to be fully healed. It just asks you to be present, to be honest, to show up. And you can do that, even if your voice shakes, even if you still flinch when someone touches the soft parts of your story. One of the hardest things about trauma is how it leaves us carrying a weight that no one asked for. It's like being handed a backpack filled with stones, stones we didn't choose, but somehow have to carry anyway. For a long time, it can feel like the stones define us. They make us stumble, slow us down, and sometimes we wonder if we'll ever be free. But what if those stones, heavy as they are, could also become something else? What if they could be the foundation for something new, a way to build meaning, purpose, even strength? This idea doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't pretend the scars aren't there, but it invites us to see the story differently, to ask, what does carrying this pain teach me about myself? About resilience? About connection? About what matters most? Making meaning from pain isn't about grand gestures or forced optimism. It's about small, quiet shifts in perspective. It's noticing how surviving trauma means you've already mastered certain things: endurance, adaptability, empathy. It's realizing that your sensitivity, the thing that sometimes feels like a curse, also lets you feel deeply, love fiercely, and understand others in ways few can. Sometimes, people talk about post-traumatic growth, the idea that suffering can lead to new strengths and insights. That's true, but it can also feel like pressure. Like, if you don't come out of trauma glowing with wisdom and grace, you've failed somehow. That's not the point. Growth isn't a rule, it's a possibility. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades. Sometimes it looks messy. Sometimes it means breaking down again before building back up. Another way meaning comes forward is through connection, choosing to turn your experience into compassion, to support others who are hurting, to speak your truth so someone else doesn't feel so alone, to create art, to write, to advocate, to listen. In these acts, your trauma doesn't just weigh you down. It becomes a bridge, linking your pain with someone else's healing. And maybe most radically, carrying trauma forward means accepting that life is messy, that healing isn't tidy or linear, that sometimes you will feel overwhelmed and exhausted. And that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to fix yourself or your story. Just carrying the stones differently, with gentleness, with awareness, with a little less blame, can make the burden lighter. In the end, what trauma asks is not for you to be perfect or to erase the past. It asks you to keep going, to keep being curious about who you are becoming, to keep choosing connection over isolation, hope over despair, presence over numbness. Because that choice, every single day, is the truest form of courage. Forgiveness is one of those words that carries a heavy weight. It can sound like a demand, as if you're supposed to forget what happened, excuse the harm done, or somehow erase your own pain to make someone else feel better. But real forgiveness is nothing like that. It's not about denying your experience or minimizing the damage. It's not about saying, "It's okay what happened," or "I'm over it." It's much more complicated, and, honestly, much more freeing. At its core, forgiveness is about freedom. It's about freeing yourself from the chains that trauma can wrap around your heart and mind. Trauma often comes with a soundtrack of anger, bitterness, resentment, and sometimes self-blame. These emotions are real and valid, but holding on to them forever, it can become a prison. Forgiveness doesn't ask you to throw those feelings away. It asks you to find a way to live despite them. One of the hardest parts of forgiveness is that it's often confused with reconciliation. They're not the same thing. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to trust the person who hurt you again or let them back into your life. It doesn't mean you have to pretend the harm never happened. Forgiveness is an internal process. It's about deciding, I'm not going to let this pain control me anymore. It's choosing to release the hold that the past has on your present. That said, forgiveness is not a quick fix. It's not a switch you flip. It's a practice, a long, often winding journey. Sometimes it means sitting with your anger, really feeling it, and letting it transform. Sometimes it means setting boundaries that keep you safe while you heal. Sometimes it means recognizing that the person who hurt you is also deeply flawed, scared, or broken themselves. Not as a way to excuse their behavior, but to understand it. Because understanding can be a step toward compassion, and compassion can be a path to peace. Forgiveness is also about forgiving yourself for surviving in ways that maybe you're not proud of, for mistakes you made, for ways you coped that didn't serve you or others. Self-forgiveness is often the hardest part because trauma can leave you with deep shame. But holding on to shame doesn't protect you. It just keeps the wound open. Forgiving yourself means recognizing that you did the best you could with the tools you had. It means extending kindness inward, even when it feels undeserved. And here's something important. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't erase history. It just changes your relationship to it. You acknowledge the pain, you honor the scars, but you don't let them write your whole story. Forgiveness lets you reclaim your narrative, not as a victim, but as a survivor with agency. Choosing forgiveness is choosing freedom. Freedom to breathe without the past choking you. Freedom to love without the bitterness clouding your heart. Freedom to move forward, not by erasing your history, but by carrying it with grace. So, here we are, the final chapter, the moment where all the threads come together. What does it mean to live beyond trauma? Not to pretend it never happened, or to be cured of it like a bad cold, but to fully integrate it into the story of who you are, to carry it with you, not as a burden that drags you down, but as part of the fabric that makes you whole and real. Trauma changes us. There's no way around that. But it doesn't have to break us. Instead, it can break open parts of ourselves that were hidden, closed off, or numbed. It can wake us up to depths of empathy and resilience we didn't know we had. It can teach us about vulnerability in a way that makes connection richer and more meaningful. But none of this happens overnight, and none of it is linear. Integration means holding both the pain and the strength, the scars and the beauty, the past and the present, together at the same time. It means recognizing that your story is not a neat line, but a mosaic. Some pieces are jagged, some are smooth, some are bright, others dark. All of it belongs. All of it shapes you. Transformation doesn't mean erasing the trauma or being someone new altogether. It means becoming more yourself. A self that is deeper, wiser, more compassionate, not only toward others, but also toward your own fragility and imperfection. It's about learning how to be present with your feelings, even the uncomfortable ones, without being overwhelmed by them. It's about building rituals and relationships that nourish your growth. It's about making peace with uncertainty and impermanence, and finding meaning in the messy, unpredictable flow of life. Living beyond trauma is also about reclaiming your agency. Trauma can make you feel powerless, stuck in a loop of fear and defense. But integration reminds you that you can choose how to respond, how to heal, and how to grow. You might not control what happened, but you do control what comes next. Every small choice, to reach out, to set a boundary, to practice self-care, to show kindness, is an act of resistance and reclamation. And perhaps most importantly, living beyond trauma is about hope. Not the naive kind that says everything will be perfect, but the grounded kind that says, I can keep going, even when it's hard. Hope that there is joy ahead, and that your life, your unique, complicated, beautiful life, still holds possibility. This journey is not easy. It is not tidy, but it is profoundly human, and it is worth it. Thank you for taking this journey with me, exploring the question, would you still be you without your trauma? The answer is complex, layered, and uniquely yours. Trauma touches you, shapes you, but it doesn't define you. You are more than your pain. You are a story still being written, a self still unfolding.